Okay, so video games. So I think that this is, I enjoy video games. Personally, I find this a really interesting topic, in part because I'm interested in video games and I'm interested in how the video game industry has changed sort of throughout my life as a gamer. And that's going to be relevant actually in a moment when we talk about how people study video games, because what people think of when they think of a video game in the 80s is potentially quite different than what it was in the 90s, which is potentially quite different than what people think of today. So, sort of the first thing to mention is the video game industry is absolutely huge. And when I was growing up, it was still very popular. Like, I had all my friends basically played video games. It was something that was still very common, but I would argue was not completely mainstream in the way that it is today. Part of that probably has a lot to do with the rise of smartphones and casual gamers, people who download something like Candy Crush. The fact that you can download a lot of games for free is probably a big part of that. People who wouldn't maybe think it was worth paying for games previously, now all of a sudden, when they have a gaming device on them at all times, if you're stuck at a bus stop or something, why not download a free game and kill some time? So this is going to be relevant because one of the things that we're going to talk about in the first few slides, when I try to set up some of this context, is the fact that trying to study video games in general and trying to understand the effect that video games in general have on the cognitive and the neurological system is a super broad question. That's kind of like saying, what impact do sports have on the cognitive system? It probably depends hugely on what sports you're playing. In the video game world, probably playing certain kinds of puzzle games might change or modulate your system differently than certain kinds of really frantic, kind of high octane, action centric games. So this is a challenge, trying to understand what impact video games have on behavior and all these things we want to study. It's a challenge because it's sort of an ill-defined problem or question. It's a big question. And so one of the things that's kind of fun about this lecture, I think, is we're looking at, in a way, we're looking at sort of an example of how to approach a topic in cognitive neuroscience using the tools and methods we've been learning about. But rather than having our starting point be some predetermined cognitive construct, like let's try to understand working memory, we're looking at kind of a real world thing. It's an activity, it's something people do. And we don't necessarily know a priori right off the bat at the beginning what systems that may or may not impact. So one of the things that's sort of interesting when you look at kind of the history of the cognitive neuroscience literature on gaming, people have been studying this for a little while. You see that people traditionally over the last couple of decades have really focused heavily on action video games, and in particular, first-person shooters. So probably most of you know what that is, but if you think about a game like Call of Duty, where you have a first-person perspective and you're running around doing various kinds of things, potentially solving puzzles, but a big part of the action is shooting and lining up your shot and trying to avoid getting shot by other players. This type of genre is almost exclusively, in some sense, what for at least a little while researchers were focused on. And again, part of that is because there is an appreciation and awareness that genres are different, and playing a puzzle game like Tetris might be very different than playing an action shooter like Call of Duty. And so researchers had to kind of think about, exactly how do you set up an experiment to try to capture data that's relevant to make inferences about the stuff you want to know about. And there was this sense that action video games might be the most likely to sort of upregulate or enhance certain kinds of cognitive abilities and processes, and in particular, things related to visual attention. Now, it's also the case that action games, and if you're a gamer, you probably know this, that first-person shooters have been extremely popular. And there really was sort of an explosion of first-person shooters in recent gaming history. Things like Call of Duty that have, are among the top-selling games every holiday, and they release a new version every year because they're that popular. So there were a lot of people playing action games and first person shooters. And so that's going to be potentially relevant too, right? If you have one type of game that you think might actually have a big impact on your brain, but almost no one plays it, that's maybe not going to be as relevant to study as something that you see a lot of people actually taking up and playing. And I don't have a fantastic answer for this. I don't have a magic bullet solution. But you can ask yourself, well, what kind of comparisons do we want to make? Ideally, maybe you would look at individually the effect of every single genre. But we can only do so much, right? We only have so many resources as experimenters. It's also the case that you have to start somewhere. So there's probably not going to be any one critical comparison, but even though a lot of the work that we're going to talk about is built from experiments focusing on first-person shooters, and even though I think that makes a lot of sense, and we'll pick up that thread and talk about how they might be different than other genres and why we might expect people who play those games to have maybe unique changes that we wouldn't see in other genres like puzzle games. There are good reasons to think about that, to sort of use those as a focal point, that genre. But we want to be kind of as a qualification, as a way to sort of guard against overgeneralizing or reading too much into the results that we get when we look at what happens when people play first-person shooters. Just keep reminding yourself that you want to be careful about overgeneralizing and saying, well, we saw video game players exhibit this change in behavior, so video games must result in this change, right? It's a bit like, you wouldn't necessarily expect that watching TV in general is going to have a universal effect on your behavior. It probably has a lot to do with what kinds of content you're watching. So to give you a little bit more context too, and kind of try to frame this a little bit, I mentioned, I think in the first slide or two, that we often, as a starting point, take a cognitive construct that we're interested in, like cognitive control, like working memory, like long-term memory. And we sort of look at all the work that's been done directed at that specific system or process or groups of systems or processes. And as I say, this is a little bit different. And we can almost think of this a little bit like a case study, this discussion we're having today. Not a case study about a patient who has a lesion in a particular part of the brain, which is something we've been talking about a lot this semester. But a case study in the sense that how do people go about trying to study and approach something complex like a real world activity when you're not sure at the beginning what systems that might impact. And in part, this is sort of how we're framing the narrative. A lot of people who are studying working memory, who you read about in the working memory chapter or in our working memory lecture slides, didn't necessarily always begin an experiment with the exclusive purpose of understanding working memory. They may have stumbled into something relevant for working memory. So it's a bit how we frame and present this stuff, but certainly based on the way this stuff is presented typically in a textbook. You sort of sort and organize and categorize based on cognitive processes of interest. And again, if you don't know what cognitive processes are potentially going to be affected, in some sense, you have to come at this a little bit differently. It's a little bit more of a pioneering kind of feel, maybe. I'll also say really briefly, I don't want to, spend too much time setting this up, but I think that given the rise of gaming that we just talked about, we have a really unique opportunity for what we could consider to be a natural experiment, where a bunch of people who maybe didn't necessarily grow up playing games are starting to play games. And we have a lot of people who probably have been playing games since before they could talk. I think I was playing games before I could read. So I would be an example of someone from an older generation who has been playing games all their life. But I think there are a lot more people around today that have been lifelong gamers than maybe was the case when I was growing up. And so, for example, people who study the effects of television, people who said, I wonder if watching television makes our children more violent. At a time when not everyone had access to many channels on their television, if any, we had another opportunity for a natural experiment where people could go into towns that for the first time ever had cable television. And you could say, okay, here's a whole town of people who have never seen cable television before. And we can see what the kids are doing on the playground when, in this town, they now have access. And we can compare it to another town that still does not have cable television. So those kind of natural experiments, even though there are a bunch of warnings and qualifications about it's all correlational, they're not true experiments, you can't make causal inferences, still present some really interesting opportunities for things that you actually couldn't really do as a real experiment anyway. I couldn't, raise someone from birth just playing video games and raise a control group of children who had never played video games. But we can start to look at some of those comparisons in a time when video games are becoming more and more popular. So just to provide a tiny bit more context, I also want to mention that this is also a discussion about how experience-dependent plasticity works, right? So remember the Greebles study. This is maybe a slightly, depending on what you're interested in, this might be a slightly more engaging way to approach that. But we're really talking about the same thing. How does what you do and what you experience change the way your system works? So I said we'd come back to this question of, well, why are people so focused on action video games? Why is that? Why did that become kind of the stimulus of choice, if you will, for video game researchers? So there's quite an interesting paper, recent paper just published this year, where this argument is kind of made that people have maybe been focusing too much on action games and overgeneralizing the results to video gaming at large. But they do a really nice job of presenting why researchers, when they had this, initial starting point and they didn't know what to look at, they didn't know what they were expecting, they didn't know which cognitive systems might be affected. There's some good logic for thinking that of all the things that might show, a clear, measurable impact on either cognition, neurology, or both, action video games might be the most likely. And so that's one way to think about this investigation as well, right? It's sort of like if you only have one shot, maybe you get funding to do one project, but you don't know if you'll get funding to do a second. Probably you want to try to produce some evidence that video games do change people's systems. So if you maybe just have one shot, maybe you go for the heavy-handed approach. Maybe you say, well, I'm going to choose stimuli that are most likely to have an effect. Sort of like if you wanted to see how fear changes decision-making, you might use a variety of fearful stimuli, but you might gravitate towards especially scary stimuli. And you might think that mildly scary stimuli would maybe not be as useful because they might be less likely to have a big effect, which means you might not get a statistically significant result, et cetera, et cetera. So as I've been talking, you've probably run down these points. And if you're familiar with action games, or even if you aren't, these probably make sense to you. It has a lot to do in general with the high task demands. There's a lot going on. There's a really fast, frantic pace. You need to both distribute your attention kind of throughout the whole environment. You got to watch out for people who are trying to shoot you, maybe snipers in the corner. It's not just what's in the center of your screen. So you have to, if you want to be good at these games, if you want to succeed, you have to have this sort of diffuse attentional state where you're taking in, at least on some level, at least to a certain extent, kind of what's happening everywhere. But then you also need to be really good at that selective attention thing. You need to focus on specific things. If you're trying to line up a shot and you're trying to shoot someone on the screen who's far away, that's going to take, a little bit of focus. Multitasking kind of fits in with this whole sort of frantic nature. You need to be able to, monitor your ammunition and maybe communicate with your teammates if you're playing a multiplayer game while watching out for snipers, while also trying to pursue someone you're trying to shoot. There's a lot going on. And all of this frantic pace means that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to automatize playing a game like this. It's we could argue it probably is possible to a certain extent. But if you think about driving, think about the difference between when you first started to learn how to drive and if you've been driving for a while, the relative ease with which you feel like you now can drive. You probably feel like you don't really need to pay super focused attention. That's dangerous. Distracted driving is a huge problem, don't get me wrong. But you probably feel like, and this is dangerous too, because we're not always good judges of this. It might be a judgment thing, but we tend to nevertheless, at least subjectively, feel like we're able to keep up reasonable task performance with some things that we're highly practiced at with minimal attention. And that would be kind of a confound. If it was the case that people who just played these games a lot just slipped into sort of an automatized mode, that would be interesting, but a different kind of interpretation. If we see that people who play games a lot exhibit different kinds of sort of behaviors or seem to process stimuli in different ways, we have a slightly more focused kind of interpretation of what's happening, because we don't have to worry about, well, maybe they just automatized it, which again would be interesting, but a very different kind of explanation than the sorts of explanations we're going to see are commonly raised or sort of used to try to make sense of or interpret the results that are found. So when you do something like this, you guys know that true experiments are very different than quasi-experiments. You know that correlational designs can never prove causation. And there's a whole lot of stuff that's uncontrolled in quasi-experimental designs. Or again, just if that terminology is more familiar to you, just correlational designs. There's a bit of a distinction there, but really the main point I'm getting at on this slide is we can't make causal inferences. And there's a whole lot of stuff, and this is why we can't make causal inferences, a whole lot of stuff that's uncontrolled when you do something like a quasi-experimental design. So if you recruit a bunch of people and you ask them whether they play games or not, and you split them into two groups and you say, this is the group that said they play games, this is the group that said they didn't play games, let's see how they compare in various measures, that's like a quasi-experimental design, because you're carving your participants up into different groups, but they're not true experimental groups. You haven't manipulated an independent variable, and in fact, in most of these situations, you haven't manipulated anything. So we will look at some data that is of the true experimental design form, but you want to keep this distinction in mind, because a lot of the work that's been done to try to understand the cognitive neuroscience of video games involves quasi-experimental designs. Of course, think about how much we learn from case studies, which are also correlational throughout the few chapters we've already covered. It's not to say that these are not valuable. You just want to be very aware of the limitations. So I said that we don't necessarily know going into this what sort of systems might be affected, but we can think about some things that even just on the sort of back of these 5 kind of defining characteristics of action video games, we might expect to be different in some way in the brain or cognitive system of video game players. So as I said, we think attention might be something that differs, and visual attention, just generally speaking, which of course isn't any one specific thing, but can encompass lots of different stuff. Working memory is probably going to be relevant, or at least we could predict it might be. Even something as simple as going back to the ammunition example. You might need to remember where ammo is located. You might need to remember where locked doors are. If you pick up keys, maybe you have to remember where the last locked door you couldn't access was before you picked up the key. That example may or may not be working memory, depending on how much time has passed between initially encountering the door and picking up the key. But you could think of lots of other examples, where your teammates are if you're doing like a squad-based game. Back to the frantic overall pace, task switching might be something that could be quite useful. Enhanced task switching abilities might be quite useful for gamers. And we might expect that games that have a lot of really fast-paced demands might encourage people to get better at task switching. And general cognitive flexibility, depending on what you're required to do in the game, might be something that we could expect or predict could differ in gamers as compared to non-gamers. If you're doing something very repetitive and sort of one-dimensional in a game, probably isn't going to be relevant. We could think of lots of games, though, where perhaps incorporating strategy might be relevant. And maybe if you do that enough and have to think hard enough about developing and implementing and monitoring these strategies, and maybe you switch your strategy on the fly depending on what the opponent are doing. Think again about a squad-based shooting game. Cognitive flexibility could very well be relevant here. I think I didn't say this out loud. You guys already know this, I know, and you probably read this, but one of the big issues we have with quasi-experimental designs is, imagine we find that gamers have more cognitive flexibility as operationalized in some way. It's tempting to say, well, gee, I guess gaming, enhanced their cognitive flexibility. But of course, we have this directionality problem. Maybe it's the case that people who have enhanced cognitive flexibility, maybe people who have enhanced visual attentional skills, maybe people who have enhanced working memory capacities, enjoy games more because they're better at them than people who don't have those enhanced abilities. So it could very well be the case that gamers are a distinct population, but there are pre-existing differences that draw them towards games rather than the converse. Maybe the games enhance those abilities once they start playing them. So we're going to, for the next few slides, look at sort of top level results. So by that, I mean, we're not going to focus specifically on what was done in the individual experiments that produce these results, but we're going to kind of give you a sort of overview of some of the kinds of differences that have been reported when comparing action gamers to non-action gamers. So you can take a look at these yourself. I'm not going to read them all out specifically, but these all have to do with fine perceptual discrimination. So these are all things that are going to speak to an action video gamer's ability to make sort of fine-grained discriminations based on visually presented or even auditorily presented information. So this better multisensory temporal processing thing might warrant a bit of explanation. The example I write here should kind of clarify what it's about. But if, for example, imagine you have a simple experiment where there's a beep and a flash of light, and they both happen almost at the same time, but the exact timing is varied. So sometimes the beep starts just a little bit earlier than the flash. Sometimes it's the other way around. Maybe other times they actually have a simultaneous onset. And this is the kind of thing that probably sounds like it should be pretty easy, but it is surprisingly challenging for most people, or I should say more challenging than the average person might expect it to be. And so part of, I mean, it's again, a fine-grained kind of perceptual discrimination. But part of what this might speak to, the fact that action video games demonstrate better multisensory temporal processing, part of what that might speak to is a sort of higher fidelity representation of stimuli, right? If you know there was a beep and a flash, but you don't know which came which, versus you have a really precise, almost time-locked sense of the beep happened and then a split second later the light flashed. This is something that may be attentional on some level, but suggests that for whatever reason they have a more sort of robust, or again, high fidelity, high resolution impression of the information that's out there. It's also the case that we see lots of effects related to response time. And this isn't limited to just one kind of response time effect. So usually in cognitive experiments, we measure response time to manual responses, like a button press, right? The clock starts, or the clock stops rather, starts when a stimuli gets presented on screen, a stimulus, and it stops when you press a button. But we can also tie response times to other kinds of responses, like a vocal response or an eye movement, a saccadic response. If you have to make an eye movement to the, if there's a rule and you have to make an eye movement to a certain part of the screen after you see a stimulus contingent on some property of that stimulus, that would be, a saccadic response time. And so this is suggesting that the fact that we see this across different kinds of response modalities sort of suggests it's not just the case that they get really good at pressing buttons, right? Because that's sort of a simplistic interpretation, but maybe we could think about that potentially. Maybe they just get really good at pressing buttons, and that makes them look like they have really fast response times relative to non-gamers. But if you measure the response time to other things, you don't see that. This isn't the case. You do see that effect. So that suggests that it's something more, it's an effect that isn't specific to one modality, like motor responses, which sort of suggests it's a more fundamental distinction in what the cognitive system is doing and how it's processing information. So any research, I just see this question on the chat now. Any research into how video games relate to ADHD? I don't know about that. And I don't know tons about ADHD, but it is interesting because it's interesting for lots of reasons. But I think some people don't realize that often ADHD and ADD, in addition to having, sometimes difficulty focusing attention, sometimes people with these kinds of diagnoses also at times have a sort of form of hyper focus where they have incredible focus on specific things that they're interested in. So that's an interesting question. I might have to look into that. Yes, I will think about that. I feel like I have nothing brilliant to say off the top of my head, but that's a good question. Yeah, and I think your suggestion too is an interesting one. I'd have to think about that a little bit. Anyway, so importantly too, it's not just the case that we see these kind of response time effects across modalities, again, suggesting it's something more fundamental about processing, not something weird or quirky about one specific modality. Importantly, we also don't see speed accuracy trade-offs, or rather the better response times, the faster response times that we see in gamers can't be explained by a speed accuracy trade-off. Oftentimes with the average person, it's very easy to get them to speed up if you give them instructions to, if you emphasize the need for speed, but almost inevitably you get this trade-off where people can do it and they still can perform reasonably well, but their accuracy goes down. And if you tell them to emphasize accuracy, people can get, even more accurate than they would normally be, but they slow down even more. So anytime you see a response time difference, you usually want to say, one of the first things you want to check for is there a speed accuracy trade-off? Because that's a very different kind of interpretation. But you don't see that with gamers. They seem to be just as accurate, but also faster. We also see that there are some differences related to working memory. You may know that sometimes people refer to working memory for visually based stuff as visual short-term memory. And we talked about this change detection paradigm when we talked about working memory. So how, if you wanted to do an experiment where you were interested in testing whether gamers had enhanced working memory capacities, maybe specifically for visually based information, you have a method you could use to test that, the change detection paradigm. They seem to have enhanced abilities related to, sort of generally speaking, processing large amounts of information simultaneously or near simultaneously. That has to do with task switching and multitasking. They also seem to have enhanced mental rotation abilities and enhanced visual spatial representations of stuff, which is probably related to working memory and in particular visual short-term memory. We also know that they have better visual search performance. And this is just sort of a random stimuli example of some visual search arrays. And it's really easy because they're circling the targets for you. And so this isn't something that's always done with visual search, but for this particular study, they had static, non-moving visual search arrays, but they also had arrays where there was movement. It was sort of more relevant to their research question. But we know that in general, if you give gamers visual search tasks, they perform better than non-gamers. And this sort of fits very nicely with, at least kind of intuitively, maybe what you think you're doing during a lot of first-person shooters. You're constantly scanning the horizon and trying to find enemies, trying to find targets, trying to find items and weapons. And oftentimes those, that ammo box is not very salient. It's not a huge bright color that has an alarm that goes off. It's something that kind of blends in with the scenery. So in some sense, we might think that there'd be a great deal of transferability or generalizability between sort of the increased demand to quickly and efficiently spot things in a game on the one hand, and sort of in a more laboratory-based setup, trying to do a more conventional, sort of maybe boring compared to Call of Duty visual search. So we've sort of gone through in sort of a flyby way, a bunch of results. So this isn't, this isn't the results that came out of one study. This is a bunch of studies. And these are in general results that are thought to be pretty solid in terms of, there weren't any confounds noted, and some of these have been replicated. So there's stuff going on. Gamers, people who play games, we can measure lots of stuff that's different in them. Again, we want to be really careful about assuming the direction of causality, if any. But it's pretty clear that people who play action games, at least, we do notice differences in a variety of different sort of systems, or rather differences in task performance that draw on a variety of different systems, some of which map on to some of the systems that speculative slide a few slides ago sort of touched on. Maybe working memory is affected, maybe attention's affected, et cetera, et cetera. So the next few slides are really going to focus on trying to sort of lean on the neuroscience part of the cognitive neuroscience, and really look at how we might be able to understand these differences on the basis of physiological differences that we can observe. So I'm going to tell you that this, just to make it easier to follow, that hypothesis one, there may be something to that, but hypothesis one is going to be something that Wu and colleagues did not find evidence for. But we could imagine, if we're just trying to sort of find a starting point, well, what kinds of differences, based on how we understand, how the brain works and what it does, and the tools we have at our disposal to measure brain activity, sort of neuroimaging in general, what kinds of differences might we expect that might be able to, on some mechanistic level, explain the behavioral differences, like faster response time. So we can rely on ERPs, right? We can put an EEG on someone and we can look at various components, various event-related potentials, to try to figure out if gamers, as compared to non-gamers, seem to demonstrate differences in these components. So remember that the N1 and the P1 are negative and positive deflections approximately 100 milliseconds after stimulus presentation. P2 and P3, sometimes written as the P200 or the P300, just like the N1 and P1 are sometimes written as the N100 and the P100. The P2 and the P3 are positive deflections at 200 and 300 milliseconds, respectively, after stimulus presentation. So you'll remember that one of the great advantages of EEGs and ERPs is they have this great temporal resolution, where you can actually sort of discriminate differences between what happens at 100 milliseconds as compared to 200 or 300 milliseconds after stimulus presentation. And we know that the earliest components that appear, like the N1 and the P1, after you hear something or see something, are largely related to early stages of sensory processing. We also know that the P2 and the P3, and in general, later components, are going to be related to, of course, later stages of processing. So this, and I included this in the figure so you can read it. And if you're skeptical, if you want to see it for yourself, you can check it out. But what this is showing you, don't worry too much about this. But what I've summarized, what this is showing you, it's showing you that the N1 and the P1, the amplitude of the N1 and the P1, the size of the response, the magnitude of the electrical response at 100 milliseconds after stimulus presentation, do not seem to reliably differ. On the other hand, if you compare the P2 and the P3, so one thing that I should mention, I guess you maybe read this if you were following along with the text, but they actually trained people in this experiment. So this was a true experiment. They had people either playing a control game or a first-person shooter. So they didn't notice a difference in the amplitude for the N1 and the P1, the early components, as a function of which condition you were in. But they did notice a difference for the P2 and the P3. There was a larger amplitude P2 and P3 in the first-person shooter condition as compared to the control condition. So this is suggesting that people who go through this training process actually, it seems to be the case that their electrical response, on some level, their neurological response, remember, we have to work really hard to figure out what this actually means. It's kind of opaque. It's not immediately obvious. You have to rely on previous research that has tried to build up theories about what these components are related to. But this is certainly suggesting that there's a stronger neural response at later stages of processing in response to stimuli on the screen. And if you have a stronger neural response, if you have a more robust neural response, at least intuitively, we might think that seems to make some sense as a possible explanation for why people might be better